Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is 𝗵𝗲𝗀𝗀. I am a multi-award winning author of epic fantasy, romantic fantasy, and sometimes epic romantic fantasy. I was going to tell you how many books I have written, but at this point I have actually forgotten and I cannot tell you if it is 26 or 27. It's actually really funny how fast you lose count. So today I thought I would be taking some time to tell you about how I got started in publishing and what led me to self-publishing. I am an indie author with all of my books, and everybody has different paths that they take to get to indie authorship. So I thought people might be interested in hearing a little bit about my background. One of the really common stigmas against indie authors is the assumption that they are indie because they couldn't make it traditionally. That was not really the case for me, but I had a series of events that led me to determine that self-publishing was ultimately the best decision for me, at least for this time. If you hear some crinkling, that is my kitten playing with a bunch of paper. I would rather she do that than be over here bumping my tripod, which she will probably also do. So I started writing at a very young age and sort of always knew that I wanted to write. I spent a lot of time typing up short stories on my dad's computer when I was a kid, and we were like the cool family because we actually had a computer in a time when that was very unusual. It was actually really funny because after I was an adult, when I was helping my mom clean out the basement one time, we found the receipt for my dad's original computer that I had learned to type on and wrote all of my short stories on and did brainstorming for my first epic fantasy series on. And man, that computer was more than $2,000 for this DOS-based. I've terribly dated myself by saying that, but anyway. So I always knew that I wanted to write. I had a lot of time to read and explore literature and fiction. We spent so much time in the library. I come from a homeschooling family. When I was very young, my parents did not live in the best school district, and after having problems with the schools, my mom decided, she was like, forget this, I can do a better job on my own. And so she did. As I got older, we moved a whole lot because of my dad's job, so it was probably better because it let us keep our own schedule instead of bouncing around from school to school. It's kind of funny to me that in the writing community there seems to be this direct homeschooled girl to fantasy author pipeline, and I don't know why that is, but man, there are a lot of us. I started developing the story that became my award-winning fantasy series, the Snake's Blood Saga, when I was 13 or 14. But my parents were very big on that all of their kids needed to have a real job. So it wasn't something that I really had an opportunity to focus on until after I had grown and gotten married, and much to my parents' dismay, dropped out of college so that I could get married. I had actually met my husband in a role-playing forum online. So we both had an interest in creative writing, and he was in the military, and when they told him that he was most likely going to a war zone, we decided that instead of waiting until I graduated from college, I should probably go ahead and marry him just in case it was the only opportunity I got to do so. He ended up not going, which was a huge blessing, and then after we were married, that was when I finally had time to sit down and start writing in earnest. At that point, I had already finished the original version of what became the first two books in the Snake's Blood Saga, but I'll get to that later. However, I didn't feel very confident in my ability to pull the story together across as many books as it needed to be, so I decided it was a good idea for me to sort of practice writing things that were shorter. I had an idea for a paranormal story, and that ended up being the first book that I sent out for queries. I spent about 6 months querying my book, Death of the Sun, and I had sort of an okay response to it. I got a couple requests for, a few chapters here and there, but eventually I got a message back from an agent who said he really liked the concept of the Aztec vampires, but paranormal was at the time not really a very hot genre anymore. We were on the cooling heels of Twilight, and there just wasn't any more room in what was an oversaturated genre. That agent was the one who first mentioned the concept of self-publishing to me. Prior to that, self-publishing had always been kind of like a death sentence for somebody's author career. But he said that he felt there was going to be a very big tide changing, and that if I wanted to pursue writing paranormal, which was a currently dead genre that no agents were probably going to touch because there wasn't any room for new paranormal books in the market, I would be better served by pursuing indie publishing. Amazon's Kindle was pretty new on the market, Kindle Unlimited made its appearance, and it was really a big time of upheaval for publishing. I had a lot of reservations at first, and I did something that was probably considered uncouth at the time, but I replied to that agent's email asking him some of my most pressing concerns about indie publishing. My biggest concern was that I had been told many times that if you went down the road of self-publishing and you failed, then traditional publishers would never want to touch your work. And he told me that really wasn't true, because there are also traditionally published authors whose books fail all the time, and the typical course of action for them was to start a new pen name and continue publishing under a different name. The expectations of what an independent author could do on their own was also really different from what they expected from traditionally published authors, so they weren't going to be held by the same benchmark. So that was encouraging to me, but I still sat on the book for a long time before I finally decided, you know what, the worst that can happen is I start building up some readership of my own and I can publish under some other name. So I self-published my first book, and despite having no idea what I was doing, I still did pretty well and earned back my expenses plus a little bit extra that I used to put toward future books. And by the time I started publishing my 𝗃𝗵𝗴𝗱 series in 2017, the genre had become very spicy and it was not something that I enjoyed writing. So I figured it was a good time to step back from what I was doing, reevaluate things, and maybe dive into fantasy, which had always been my true love and what I really wanted to write anyway. Over the course of the years that I was putting out the paranormal stories, I finished writing all 6 books in my epic fantasy series, the Snake's Blood Saga. I had originally written it as 3 books, and then I ended up splitting it into 6 because I was told that long fantasy books did not sell. Somebody better let Brandon Sanderson know, because I don't think anyone has warned him. So the books were split so that none of them were longer than 125,000 words. I had to do a lot of rewriting to make the splits clean, but overall I think I did a pretty good job. I started querying the first book in that series, Serpent's Mark, in 2017. And really the response was nothing like I expected it would be. I was not prepared for the level of sexism I would encounter when I started querying an epic fantasy series. One of the very first rejections I got back was from a female agent who wrote a one-line response that said, "Women do not write adult fantasy, women write children's books." Having grown up reading, books by Mercedes Lackey and Marion Zimmer Bradley and Anne McCaffrey, I was shocked. I was like, what do you mean women don't write adult fantasy? I spent my entire life reading adult fantasy by women. You don't have any clue what you're talking about. I received quite a few rejections that said that fantasy as a whole was a dead genre and that it was not going to go anywhere. I had a number of agents reject it because they said they didn't want anything that was written with the intention of it being a series, because it is not up to me, the author, to decide whether or not a series should be a series. That's a choice the publisher gets to make. But I was never really comfortable marketing my book as a standalone with series potential, because even though the first book ends in a place that wraps itself up fairly nicely, it really felt misleading to me, and I didn't want to back myself into any kind of contract where I wouldn't be able to finish the series on my own, especially since I had already written, you know, almost 700,000 words in this series. I had a number of rejections that were based on the fact that I was female. I got one rejection that was hilarious to me that literally was just one line that said, no, sent from my iPhone. I had several that told me they were rejecting the book because there was no market for romantic fantasy. I kind of wonder how those agents feel now. And then I got one rejection that really was meaningful to me because she sat on the book for months after reading it, and she wrote back to me and she said that she absolutely loved it. She was really excited about it. She was really passionate about it, but she just did not believe that the current market for books would support fantasy. So she didn't think that she could sell it. But I still continued to query for another year after that point. And then along the way, I also submitted directly to some publishers because there are some publishers that do events where they will accept unagented manuscripts, and then they'll have an acquisitions editor contact you, and at that point you can go find an agent pretty easily because you've already got somebody who's interested in your work. At that point, I had a smaller publisher interested in the book, and I know people really like it when you name names, but out of a sense of professionalism and also out of respect for my own safety, I am not going to be disclosing any identifying information about who this publisher was. But they loved the book. I was not really surprised because at that point I had had several agents who also said they loved the book but didn't think they could sell it. But this small publisher was interested in taking a gamble and giving me a chance. And they were also willing to work with me on the book being part of a series. So if they ultimately decided they didn't want the second book or the rest of the series after that, they were willing to give me a contract that would let me at least go on to self-publish the rest of the series so that nothing would be left hanging. I felt like it was a pretty good deal. The advance money was nothing impressive, but it would have paid some bills and I would have been happy with that overall. I was very excited about signing a contract with this publisher, but I still wanted to have the opportunity to send the contract out, if not to an agent, then to a literary lawyer, just to make sure that all of my bases were covered. So I asked for a little bit of time to consider it before signing. And before I even heard back from the literary lawyer that I contacted to speak to about the contract, that was when the text messages started. Unfortunately for me, one of the editors in the publisher, someone who it would have been unavoidable for me to not work with, liked me very much in ways that were extremely inappropriate for the kind of working relationship that we were supposed to have. Several of the people in the company were like, oh, that's just that editor, they're just jokes, let it roll off your back. But this person decided they wanted me to be part of certain fantasies that they had that I was extremely not okay with, and it was wildly inappropriate. And when I didn't reply to the email or the instant messages, then I got text messages at 3 in the morning. And I remember laying there in bed, looking down at my phone and thinking to myself, I haven't even signed with you yet, and you are already mistreating me. And I'd heard a lot of stories about the harassment of women working in the publishing industry. I found that behavior so uncomfortable and so unsettling. And the way that it was just treated as something normal within this company, like it was just something that you had to keep in stride, it was like, what is wrong with you people? This isn't normal, this isn't acceptable, and women shouldn't have to be treated this way just to get ahead. So I kind of made the decision, you know, looking at those texts in the middle of the night, that I was not going to go through with it. I was going to cancel the whole contract, just rip everything up, be like, sorry guys, I'm leaving. I don't think this working relationship is going to work out. And I made the decision that there was not going to be anybody in charge of my publishing career except me. Nowhere along the line had anybody ever told me that they thought my work was bad. What I was told repeatedly was that nobody thought there was a market for the things that I was trying to write, but they enjoyed the stories that I was putting out. So that gave me the confidence to try to do things on my own. I spent several years researching and preparing to make sure that when I started publishing my fantasy books, that I would be able to do a really good job. So when 𝗀𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗀 finally launched as an indie title, it launched to over 100 pre-orders. I was signing stacks of books and shipping them off. It spent several days as the #1 best-selling fantasy title on Amazon, not just in the US, but also in Canada and in the UK. And that really proved to me that I did have what it took to eventually become a successful author on my own. There have been a lot of ups and downs in not only my sales, but also my ability to write consistently since I put out that book, which was in March of 2020. But I have continued to grow as a writer and also as a publisher, and I definitely feel like there is always room to grow and adapt as I go. So even though I'm not doing a very good job of keeping my books at the top after they launch, I know that books don't expire, so I can always pull these back up and get them going again as I'm learning new techniques for marketing and new ways to get my work seen. I continue to write while I'm doing that learning because it gives me more things that I can promote and lets me cast my net a little bit wider. And eventually when something does take off, I'm going to have a huge backlist that's ready for people to explore and enjoy. There were a lot of times in the first year that I had a lot of doubt of whether or not I was actually seeing any kind of success. And then I got an email about 𝗀𝗶𝗀𝗀𝗀 telling me that the book had been nominated for a literary award by several people, and I actually don't know who. I didn't really think that I stood any chance. And it took my good friends, my posse that you will see I acknowledge in the front of the book. They really had to push me to go to this banquet. I was terrified of going and having to deal with the big emotions of feeling like a fraud in the middle of this room full of all these traditionally published authors who were so successful. And I remember sitting there at the banquet table thinking, Nora Roberts is an author who gets nominated for this award. Who am I? I sat across from the editor of the longest running publication for speculative fiction in the US. So it was in this room with all these people who were way more qualified than me that I won my first literary award with the book of my heart that I had come up with when I was a very young teen. And I believed in when nobody else was willing to. And I still kind of cannot believe that happened to me. I was so not prepared. I had not prepared anything to say because I had just gone in with the assumption that me being a small nobody who independently published, I would never stand a chance, but I did. And it was the most surreal thing afterwards, seeing my name published in the awards acknowledgements of all of these literary magazines and resources. It's like I can point to Locus and say, hey, my name was in there as an award winner. And that's just absolutely incredible. And it gave me a little bit more courage to try to pursue things. And ever since then, I've just been focusing on writing the things that I love without worrying too much about whether or not they'll sell. It's always nice to have a book that takes off and brings in enough money that it can pay for the others, but my writing income has been stable enough that I've always been able to focus on the things that I've really been passionate about, and that means more to me than anything. Different people have different reasons for writing. Some people are really ambitious about being like the huge successful names, and other people just want to write because it's something that they love that they don't think they can do without. And I feel like that has always been a more accurate description of me There have been several times through the years that I've been like, I can't do this, I'm quitting, and I think I make it for all of like 6 weeks before I just sit down and write another book. So I couldn't give up even if I wanted to. 2 years ago, I finished publishing the Snake's Blood Saga, and I started publishing my current epic fantasy series, which is Spectrum Legacy. The third book in Spectrum Legacy won the Richard Wright Literary Award and was named Best YA Fantasy of 2023 by the Memphis Public Library System. So if nothing else, I guess I know I can write because other people keep giving me awards for it. Which I'll take it, don't get me wrong, but there's always that little voice that's kind of like, are you sure? But that's my story pretty much, and when I get to this point, usually the main question that people have for me is whether or not I would ever pursue traditional publishing again. I would say yes, but I feel like I would be really picky about which publishers I would be willing to work with, and I would also probably get myself in trouble by refusing to tolerate editors who are not going to treat me well. I have a very small handful of publishers that I feel comfortable enough knowing their reputation and knowing how they treat the authors that they work with that I would be excited to work with them. But at the moment, since I'm working on finishing a series that I'm publishing independently, I'm not in any hurry to consider ever trying to do traditional publishing again. It's not something that's completely off the table, but I don't feel like it meets my current needs, and that's what's most important to me right now. I think this will end up being the longest video that I have shared. This is going to be fun to edit, but I'll stop there, and I guess I'll be back next week to share something then. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to sharing more of this writing adventure with you in the future. Take care, and I'll see you next time.